Ferd Block was an established businessman in the Thibodaux area before entering broadcasting. We recently spoke with his son Harold on his father's venture into the airwaves.
Harold Block, how are you today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Very good. Well, let's go back some 50 years ago. Of course, your father worked with Mr. Jackson and Mr. Larson to get the station underway. Why did he want to go into radio?
Well, although I never discussed it with him, I think probably it was simply the fact that my dad loved starting new businesses. If Thibodaux needed a particular savings and loan or a radio station, he thought there was a need for a business, then he enjoyed starting them and getting them running. And then once he had the right people in place, he would move on and get involved with another business. I think he thought Thibodaux was big enough that it needed a radio station. And so he got together with Mr. Jackson and Mr. Larson, both of whom knew things he didn't know. And they got the license from Washington, and off they went, and they started KTIB.
Well, tell us about that fateful day on Christmas Eve, 1953, when the station first signed on.
Well, I can remember, Bill, going over to the location of the radio station, which was on top of the Comet over on Jackson Street. And for some reason, it was on the second floor. And for some reason, I can remember, because this is 50 years later, but I can remember they played a song that was popular at that time called Lady of Spain. I didn't particularly like the song, and I can remember it playing as we were up there on the second floor listening to the first broadcast ever.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the station, your father, of course, owned it for the first 20 years through 1973. Along the way, a lot of great people worked here along, and I'd like to ask you about one particular person who we all now know from dialogue and came to the station in November of '54. Your memories of Marie Bergeron?
Well, Marie was the person who really kind of kept KTIB together. I think she handled the personnel as beautifully as anyone could handle personnel, but she also was on air. Marie did everything, and she did election night coverage. She did dialogue, which was a wonderful community program, and she's sort of the first lady of Thibodaux, and she really was a great asset to KTIB, and she was a wonderful, wonderful friend of my father's.
Let's also talk about another gentleman who I believe came on as station manager in 1955 and had two different tenures here. Of course, he would later buy the station in 1973. Your memories of Raymond Sadie?
Well, Ray is a great radio man. He's a good businessman, and he's also a lot of fun. And he really helped establish KTIB. KTIB became quite a presence in the community when the hurricanes would hit, when Hurricane Betsy hit, and so forth. KTIB stayed on the air when no other station did, and it was Ray and some others who really kept KTIB going and made it into a great institution.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, there's countless people we could talk about, but in the essence to save time, there's another gentleman we need to talk about who was probably here going on 45 years, who did a lot of entertainment, a lot of Cajun music. Your memories of Leroy Martin?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, and I hadn't really thought about it, I believe Leroy came on Saturday mornings. And his program was very, very popular. He would sing not only Cajun music, but Western music and other types of music. And for the people in the Luche area, that may have been the most popular program KTIB has ever had. People love listening to Leroy Martin.
Mm-hmm. I'd also like to ask about another show that ran on Sunday mornings for a long time. On the Southern Tones Gospel show as well, it was quite a pretty pronounced show as well.
That was a great program, and I don't remember as much of that program as I do Leroy Martin, but I know that was a very popular program.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to also ask you about, of course, the Comet building was the first home of KTIB, and then I believe, was it in 1968 he moved to Canal Boulevard for the first federal building?
Right. I don't know the exact year, but I do know where the sheriff's office on Canal Boulevard is currently located. That was the first federal building, which my father had founded in 1956, and he was the president of First Federal. And he also moved KTIB over there, and I think the Deramies had their law office in the rear. And they needed more space. They were expanding, so they moved over to Canal Boulevard and were there for quite a while.
Right, and I believe that was roughly until 1967 when they came over to the building we're in right now on Green Street. That sounds about right?
That probably is correct, and I have fond memories of all three locations. One of the things I can remember very well is coming to the present location on Green Street. when the elections were going on. Election nights, Saturday nights, and of course Marie Bergeron was in charge of all that. And this was pre-computer days. Today you have Excel spreadsheets, and you put the numbers in from one precinct, it automatically totals everything. Well, things were relatively confused back in those days. We'd get an AP report about what the election returns were, and we broadcast it. Then we get a UPI report, and it was, hundreds and maybe thousands of precincts behind, so we broadcast those. And it got to be very confusing at times, but by the end of the night, we normally had the final numbers, and we would broadcast those.
I was going to say, I guess in live radio, that's the one thing, unfortunately, is that you make a mistake, you still got to move on the best way you can.
Well, at least I would make some mistakes. I don't know about other people, but we'd report what we knew at the time, and then we'd move on. And again, it was lots of fun. I was a young kid at the time, and we'd have a great time up here. But I do remember it was very difficult trying to follow all the numbers that were coming in from all the different sources.
Now, of course, there's so many stories and people we can talk about that thankfully we have covered in other interviews. But I'd like to fast forward to 1973. Why did your father decide to sell the station at that point?
Well, I think Dad's thoughts were that KTIB was a thriving business, and yet he and Mr. Larson and Mr. Jackson were getting on in age, and none of the three had any children who were involved with radio. My family was pretty well diverted in other fields. My brother and I practice law. My sister lives in Texas, and my other sister was in the jewelry business with Dad. And I think he just figured that it would be better for someone that would have a succession plan and so forth to come in and take it over. So Mr. Larson, Mr. Jackson, and my dad decided to sell, which they were very pleased to sell to. I believe the buyers were Ray Sadie, Ken Whitens, and Jimmy Bouquet at Houma. And they're all three fine gentlemen, and Dad was real pleased that they bought the station.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, I don't want to forget, also, there was a period, I think, starting in the late 60s, KTIB also had an FM signal as well, right?
It was KTIB-AM and FM, and I could be wrong about this. I think the FM was mainly pre-recorded music. Back in the world changes and always evolves, and it's really sort of amazing. Back in those days, an FM station really had very little value. Lots of people, if the listeners can believe this, lots of people didn't have FM radios. They would have an AM radio, but not an FM radio. And today, of course, the situation is reversed. Many people lit FM, and I think more so probably than AM, although I don't know what the numbers are. But FM today is a very significant factor in the radio market. But they really just started it so that they'd have a full coverage. It was not anything that I think they thought would go anywhere, and of course, it has gone very far.
Very much so. Well, I tell you what, we definitely appreciate all your time for coming down here. And before we head out, is there anything you'd like to say to our listeners?
No, I think that KTIB has served the area and the community very well. Again, I can remember 1965 when Hurricane Betsy hit. I think the Civil Defense and the Sheriff's Office and pretty much all the authorities were using KTIB to get the word out because the electricity was off. There was no telephone service. And I think KTIB in 1965 after Betsy and for many, many, many years has performed a real valuable community service. And I know my dad would be happy today if he were still here. Unfortunately, he passed away 2.5 years ago. But he would be pleased that KTIB is celebrating its 50th anniversary.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we continue our KTIB 50th anniversary series, with us in the studio today is a gentleman whose father was very instrumental in getting KTIB off the ground, and we'll tell a lot of stories about all the many different people that worked here, the events that helped make KTIB a solid station that it is and has been in Thibodaux history. Jerald Block, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, William. How are you?
Very good. Well, let's start from the beginning. Are you from our area originally?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Thibodaux. I was born in 1946. I was the youngest boy in my family, but I had an older sister and an older brother. And so I was born in 1946, and my understanding is I was young at the time, but my dad, Ferd Block, Sam Larson, and Ed Jackson were the original owners of the radio station. They founded KTIB, I think, in 1953. And so they founded it. I'm not real clear about exactly what took place, William, regarding why they got involved in it and why they were interested in it. But my dad was a man that had no hobbies. He wasn't a fisherman. He wasn't a hunter. He loved just working and starting businesses. So he got together with Sam Larson, who was a person who was born and raised in Matthews, Louisiana, and Ed Jackson, who owned the Comet, the Daily Comet, part of the Daily Comet, with Joe Silverberg. And they got together, those three men, and started KTIB. And I think they started it because there weren't any radio stations around, and they thought it was a good business venture.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Now, I understand that you had a decent tenure with the station as well, and you did a lot of different jobs along the way, right?
Yeah, I did. I was actually an announcer for a while, but before I was an announcer, I actually was the janitor at KTIB. I would come in after school and clean up, and that was when Ray Sadie was here, and Marie Bergeron, and Leroy Martin, and so I was part of the team, so to speak, or at least I was told I was part of the team, when the truth is all I was the janitor and cleaned up and did that sort of thing. But I did that when I was in school. I enjoyed working here. I enjoyed knowing all the people, and radio in those days was such a big deal and such a an important media for the city, for the town of Thibodaux, and so it was exciting for me to be just part of it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the first 7 years of the station, I believe, was located on top of the Daily Comet, right?
That's exactly right. That's where it was, and then it moved over here to where the sheriff's office is, which was the first federal part of the first federal building.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the first couple of years, and I didn't remember it was 7, but it was at the Daily Comet building.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of good people help put the station together. That is, as on-air personalities. So, because without good personalities, you don't have any kind of a station. And I like to talk about Marie Bergeron for a bit because she came here, I believe she told me November '54, and I tell you what, it's incredible. She was in broadcasting for 45 years here in at KHOM. And it's incredible the rapport she has had with people, not just in the interview room, but out on the street every day.
Yeah, Marie was just this kind of exceptional person. My dad had this incredible gift. He could find people like Marie Bergeron and give them so much authority, and he really just built upon their potential. He would take a person like Marie, who was young at the time, who was really not familiar with radio at the time, and sit there and say, you can do this job. And she did a great job. She had rapport with everybody because she knew who to ask the hard-hitting questions to, but she knew the sales side of the business. She knew the reporting side of the business. I mean, she's a charm.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Mr. Sadie earlier. I believe he came on board around 1955. And the one consensus I get from all the people I've spoken to is that here's a man who was paid very good attention to detail and was also one heck of a good salesman as well.
One heck of a good announcer also. I mean, he was a good salesperson, but, Ray Sadie had a great radio voice. And, he did announcing, he did, cut the commercials, he did all that sort of thing. And, of course, he was the kind of guy that everybody liked, too. He was easy to meet, he was easy to know, and so he and Marie were really a great team together. I mean, they ran the station in the infancy days when the station was really, trying to kind of get on its feet and that sort of thing. And Ray and Marie just did a fabulous job. But together, I mean, they really had a wonderful rapport between them. That they were always kind of joking with each other, but when the time came to do business, they could do business with the best of them.
Mm-hmm. They also mentioned Leroy Martin. Leroy had mentioned to me a while back. He actually joined the station, I think, the second week they were on the air, and stayed here as an entertainment mainstay for almost 4 decades. And, very, very devoted to Cajun music and other forms of culture. And he just easily must have been one heck of a dynamic personality.
Yeah, he was. I would often work on Saturdays. And of course, I was off of school on Saturdays, so I'd come into the radio station if I couldn't get everything done. My janitorial work, if I couldn't get that done in the afternoon. And Leroy was there, and he had a program in which he would speak French. And so it was this really wonderful experience for the city and for the area that Leroy would get on there and talk French and really handle the music, but also what was going on and let people know what was going on. And it was a wonderful program. I mean, it makes me feel sad to some extent that part of that culture is missing now, that we don't have it as much as we used to.
Mm-hmm. And I want to tell you a story, and I'm not sure if you would remember this, but I talked to a former employee of the station who didn't want to be named. But I talked about show you how the culture of radio has changed. In the late 50s, KTIB had an announcer, I believe his name was Jim Eisner. And what had happened was he wanted to pull a practical joke on your father on the air. So Jim Eisner one day was dying to put a song, Happy Birthday Baby. And he decided to go on the air and tell everybody, we'd like to play this song in honor of Mr. Ferd Block, whose birthday was today. But it wasn't really his birthday. He just wanted an excuse to play the song.
No, I didn't know about that. This is a new story to me.
Right.
But one of the things I want to tell you is Marie Bergeron and I always had a special connection with each other. And years after I became a lawyer in Thibodaux and I was practicing law, Marie called me up one day and she said, Jerald, I have to show you something. When you were working at KTIB as a janitor, I found how much you were getting paid. And I really honestly think that you were probably overpaid. And so I have your application as the janitor at KTIB, and I'm going to give it to you. And she gave it to me, and she showed me I was making $1 an hour. That's how much I was getting paid, $1 an hour working at KTIB, cleaning up and that sort of thing. So when she was saying that I was overpaid, she was being facetious about it, but I think there was a part of her that was being truthful, too. I was a young kid, at the time. But it was great. It was extra spending money for me. I loved it. And, again, I was able to hang around a radio station.
Mm-hmm.
When I can remember so vividly the times when there would be hurricanes and different things like that, and my dad, again, who never really was a man of many hobbies, who really just concentrated on his work, he would bring us all into the radio station and we would serve coffee and donuts and that sort of thing to all the people who were working, because the radio station would stay on the air all long so people could know what was going on with the hurricanes. And I can particularly remember that with Hurricane Hilda. I think that was 1964. I remember it certainly with Hurricane Betsy, which was a serious hurricane that hit our area in 1965. My dad actually in that period of time was in New York with my mom, and so I came to the radio station and helped out around the radio station during that period of time. I was in college. But it was an exciting time. It was exciting being part of the family that owned KTIB. It was just one of those institutions of community that we all really still proud of today.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I believe it was around 1967, the station moved from First Federal to where we are today on Green Street. Am I correct?
That's exactly right. It moved from First Federal. In those days, you could, when it was at the sheriff's office or the First Federal's office, in those days, what would happen is you could actually look into the building and see the broadcaster, and you could actually watch him going on. So when it moved up here and the broadcast booth became upstairs, to me, there was something missing there, because you couldn't just walk along the street and see the person broadcasting like you could over there. It was exciting.
The only unfortunate part, which I wanted to get for the anniversary series, but Mr. Dan Bournet couldn't get it to me in time, and I won't go into the details of all of it, but I think you might remember the Raymond Sadie interview he did with Sheriff Eddie St. Marie during that storm.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a classic. I mean, Dan Bournet was a classmate of mine at Thibodaux High School, graduated in 1964. So I can remember, of course, him working here at the radio station and being part of participating in it. And Dan Bournet and I have remained good friends to this day. So it's too bad, though. The Sheriff Eddie St. Marie interview is truly one of the classics. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
I'd also like to ask you about another gentleman who actually had two different stints here at KTIB. I believe his first stint was in the 60s, and everybody knows him not only as a good newsman, but a good announcer as well, Roy Vicknair.
Yeah, I don't know when Roy was here, but Roy had this great, this great radio voice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was perfect on the radio, and he was here for a long time. And then again, I think he did come back for a second stint, but I don't remember those years. I mean, I don't remember the precise years. I remember Roy very well, but I just don't remember the time periods that he was here.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a great radio broadcaster for KTIB.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, we can go off and talk about all the good constant people that worked here. I've interviewed many of them from the 60s as well. Hugh Smith, of course, was one of them, who was an engineer for a good while.
Well, Hugh Smith was not only the engineer, though, he was an announcer, too. And so Hugh would do double duty. What Hugh would do is he would go out and fix the tower and do things like that and work on the station and make sure it was up and running and do whatever needed to be done. And then what he would then do is come back to the station, and he would get on the air and stay on the air as an announcer for hours. I mean, and he had again another great radio voice. You know, there's so many of those people that I remember. Then I can always kind of remember their voices and the modulations of their voices and everything like that. It kind of brings back in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to get to, fast forward a little bit, of course, 1973 was a benchmark year in KTIB history. Your father decided to sell the station that year to Raymond Sadie and his partners. What was the reason for selling it?
Well, I think at that point in time, my father was actually, my father died 2 years ago in May of 2001, and he died at the age of 95 years old. And I think in the 70s, he started to think it's time to divest myself of some of the holdings that he had, KTIB being one of those. And I think he felt as though Raymond Sadie and Marie and the people like that deserved to have the opportunity to buy the radio station, to own the radio station. They had been so participatory in its success for years. Then I think he felt like, you know, this is going to be the opportunity to let them buy in at a reasonable price. And Sam Lorison, I don't remember whether he was still alive during that time period, but I know that he had some bad health. And so I think my dad and Sam Lorison and Ed Jackson just decided this was a good time for them to sell. But I do think it was really just an opportunity also for Raymond to own the station, and that's what my dad wanted.
Mm-hmm. So I take it 20 years of broadcasting, your father owned the station from the 50s to the 70s, a very formative time, not just for our country, but for our state as well. And it sounds like, you know, not just through radio, but of course I remember Block Furniture and all the other holdings he had. He, dare I say, was probably one of the best businessmen Thibodaux ever had.
Well, he was. You know, he was, my dad, when he was young, he was an orphan. And so he grew up, his dad had died very young, and his mom had to go back to school to earn a living, and she went to Touro Nursing School in New Orleans. And during that period of time when she was in nursing school, she had to put my dad and his brother and sister into an orphanage. And it was in New Orleans. They lived there for a while, and I think my dad, you know, just was kind of one of those people that was driven. He wasn't afraid of taking risks. He wasn't afraid of going into a new business venture. He wasn't the type person who was insecure about what he was capable of. And so he loved starting new businesses and forming new businesses. And, you know, the testament to that is First Federal Savings and Loan, which he was a founder of, Block Furniture Store, which he didn't found, but that he bought, Ellis Pro Department Store, which he bought into, Peacock Jewelry and Gift Shop, which was one of my dad's businesses, which he did form. So, I mean, he just was that type of man. You know, he wasn't afraid of risk. He wasn't afraid to fail, and he took chances, and he made a great success out of those things that he was involved in.
Mm-hmm. And one of my other favorite stories about him came from Roy Pugh. Roy was one of the last employees I think he hired before he sold the station, and one day when Roy took the job to come work over here is when Mr. Block decided that he was going to sell the station. And so about a couple of months into Roy's tenure here, they went down to Block Furniture. They get a few pieces for their new house. And Mr. Block made sure that instead of asking Roy how work was doing, he asked Mrs. Pugh,
because he had the feeling was that the wife will give you a more honest answer, because sometimes the employee might be willing not to be too honest if he wasn't happy.
Yeah, my dad was like that. He had kind of a curious sense of humor, you know. He did know how to get the right answers from people. And so if he was not going to ask, or I haven't heard that story, but I don't doubt it. He was pretty sharp about being able to ask the proper person the question. And he often did that with my brother and I when we would get in trouble, and he would tend to know which one of us was the most vulnerable to the truth. So, but you know, I will say this to you too, and I would feel bad about it if I didn't do this. One of my dad's favorite people in the whole world was your grandfather, Bill Taylor. And he was always so respectful of your grandfather, knew your grandfather very well. And, you know, even though your grandfather was from Mississippi and had come here into Thibodaux and moved in, he would always say that your grandfather was one of the most special, honest, forthright business people he ever dealt with.
Very much so, and of course, not to sound braggadocious, but a lot of people had said the same thing to me over the years as well. Even though he's not been with us now for 8 years, you still hear it almost every day as well.
Well, he was a special man, and again, he was the type man that my father thought a lot of, because he was a self-made man like my dad.
Very much so. Well, we really appreciate your time coming up here and talking about those many great stories from KTIB. Before we head out, is there anything you'd like to say to our listeners?
Well, you know, I would say this. I would say that my dad's interest in the radio station probably was because he loved Thibodaux. He wanted Thibodaux to be to have everything that it should have, you know, a savings and loan association, a radio station, that sort of thing. So he was committed to the community, and I think that was probably as important as any other reason for him starting a business. But he loved being involved in it. He loved the personalities involved, some of whom, not all of whom, we've mentioned here today. But it was a great experience for my family. We loved it.
Well, we appreciate your time.
And we thank Thibodaux, because we all are very much committed to Thibodaux.
Ferd Block, recognized business leader,